Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Baxter State Park, Maine, 3 summers ago. I still wake up screaming some nights. The memory's as fresh as an open wound. I'd always been what you might call a loner. Growing up with 3 rowdy brothers in a small apartment taught me to cherish solitude. When I landed a job as a software developer that let me work remotely, I saved up enough to buy a small cabin on the outskirts of Millinocket, Maine. It wasn't much, just a 1-bedroom structure with questionable plumbing, but it was mine, and it backed up against thousands of acres of wilderness. My German Shepherd, Ranger, was my only companion. A rescue, with one ear permanently flopped over from an old injury, he'd been by my side for 6 years. We'd developed a routine of weekend hikes through the lesser-known trails of Baxter State Park, always pushing a little further, exploring a little deeper. That summer had been unusually hot and dry. Forest fire warnings were posted throughout the park, and the local news reported that wildlife was venturing closer to towns in search of water. I should have paid more attention to these signs. I should have stayed home. But the call of the Knife Edge Trail had been nagging at me for months. It's one of the most dangerous hikes in the Northeast. A narrow, jagged ridge connecting Pomola Peak to Baxter Peak, with 1,000-foot drops on either side. Not for the faint of heart, and definitely not recommended for solo hikers. But I'd been training for it, and with the forecast showing a brief break in the heat, I decided to make a 3-day trip of it. I'd camp 2 nights, summit Mount Katahdin via the Knife Edge, and return triumphant. On the first morning, Ranger and I set out at dawn. The air was thick with humidity, but a light breeze made it bearable. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the usual sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, distant streams, seemed muted somehow. I dismissed it as an effect of the dry spell. We reached our first campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing near Chimney Pond. I pitched my tent, filtered water from the pond, and settled in for the evening. Ranger seemed on edge, his head constantly swiveling toward the dense tree line to the north, occasionally emitting a low growl. "What is it, boy?" I asked, scratching behind his good ear. "Probably just a squirrel." But he wasn't convinced, and his unease was contagious. As darkness fell, I built a small fire within the designated fire ring and heated up my freeze-dried beef stew. The flames struggled to stay lit, sputtering and smoking despite the dry wood, and the color, it seemed to shift between orange and an unnatural bluish green when I wasn't looking directly at it. I chalked it up to tired eyes and minerals in the wood. The forest's silence pressed in around us, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. Each time, Ranger's ears would perk up, and he'd stare intently into the darkness beyond the firelight. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of being watched by countless eyes from between the trees and of a tall, emaciated figure stalking through the underbrush. I woke several times to find Ranger alert, standing rigid at the tent entrance, his hackles raised. Morning brought fog so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead. My phone showed no service, expected in the backcountry, but my GPS device was acting strangely, showing our location jumping erratically across the map. After several frustrating minutes, I decided to rely on my paper map and compass instead. We broke camp and continued toward Chimney Pond Trail, planning to reach the base of the Knife Edge by nightfall. The fog persisted, transforming familiar landmarks into looming, distorted shapes. The trail seemed to shift beneath my feet, sometimes appearing narrower than I remembered from previous hikes, sometimes disappearing entirely. Around noon, we came across something that made my blood run cold. A hiking boot, a good one, expensive, lay in the middle of the trail. It looked relatively new, not weathered enough to have been there long. More disturbing was the dark stain that covered the inside and spilled out onto the ground beneath it. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding flat in the thick air. "Anyone need help?" No response but the soft dripping of condensation from the trees. Ranger sniffed the boot and backed away, whining. I took a photo with my phone, marked the location on my map, and decided to report it once we returned to civilization. Someone could have been injured, or worse. As we continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Every few minutes I'd spin around, half expecting to catch someone, or something, ducking behind a tree. There was never anything there, but the sensation persisted. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned slightly, but the sky had darkened with storm clouds. We were making slower progress than planned, and I realized we wouldn't reach our intended campsite before nightfall. I consulted my map and found a marked backcountry site about a mile ahead. We arrived as the first fat raindrops began to fall. The site was a small clearing surrounded by ancient spruce trees that seemed to lean inward, creating a claustrophobic feeling that set my teeth on edge. No one else was around, unsurprising given the weather and how far we were from the main trails. I quickly set up my tent and got Ranger and myself inside just as the rain intensified into a downpour. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the tent in harsh blue-white flashes. In one of those flashes, I saw a silhouette against the tent wall, a tall, impossibly thin figure with what looked like antlers or branches extending from its head. I scrambled for my flashlight, heart pounding. When I shone it at the tent wall, there was nothing there. Ranger growled deeply, staring at the exact spot where I'd seen the figure. "It's just a tree," I whispered, trying to convince myself more than him. The storm raged for hours. The rain became so heavy that water began seeping through the tent floor despite the rainfly. Exhaustion eventually overcame my fear, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. I dreamed of an old man with deeply lined skin and milky eyes. He sat across from me at a campfire that burned too blue and too cold. "You've wandered into its territory," he said, his voice like gravel. "The Wendigo hunts these woods when the summer runs long and hot." "Wendigo?" I asked, the word feeling strange on my tongue. "Born of human greed and desperation," the old man continued. "A spirit of hunger that can never be satisfied. It was once a man, like you, a prospector, lost in these woods over 100 years ago. Winter came early that year. He resorted to eating his dead companions, then hunting the living. The more he consumed, the hungrier he became, until hunger was all that remained of him." "It's just a legend," I argued. The old man's eyes seemed to look through me. "All legends begin somewhere, son. This one begins with Jeremy Coldwell, and it continues with anyone foolish enough to intrude on his hunting grounds during a drought." I woke with a start to absolute silence. The storm had passed, and dim, gray light filtered through the tent fabric. Ranger was gone. "Ranger," I called, my voice cracking with morning dryness and fear. The tent door was still zipped closed. I scrambled outside, calling his name with increasing desperation. The clearing was empty, the ground mud-slick from the night's rain. I spotted Ranger's paw prints leading to the edge of the campsite and then into the forest, accompanied by another set of prints, impossibly large with long, claw-like toe marks. Panic seized me. I grabbed my day pack, stuffing it with water, my GPS, and first aid kit, leaving the tent and most of my gear behind. I followed the tracks into the woods, calling for Ranger every few steps. The tracks led me off the established trail, deeper into virgin forest. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the morning light. The air grew colder the farther I went, my breath fogging in front of me despite it being July. After what felt like hours, I heard a familiar bark in the distance. Relief washed over me. "Ranger, come here, boy." I pushed through a thick stand of underbrush and emerged into a small clearing dominated by a massive, lightning-scarred pine tree. Ranger stood at its base, tail wagging at the sight of me. "Jesus, you scared me half to death," I said, kneeling to embrace him. That's when I noticed what lay behind him, a crude shelter made of broken branches and what looked distressingly like human bones, yellowed with age. Animal carcasses in various states of decay hung from the lower branches of the pine, and the ground was littered with more bones: deer, moose, and smaller animals, but also unmistakably human skulls and femurs. My stomach lurched. I grabbed Ranger's collar and started backing away. He growled, not at me, but at something behind me. I turned slowly. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, inhumanly tall and thin, its skin stretched tight over an emaciated frame, the color of sun-bleached wood. Its fingers extended into curved, blackened claws, and atop its elongated head sat an elaborate crown of antlers. The face was the worst part. Almost human, but twisted with hunger, the mouth too wide and filled with needle-like teeth. It sniffed the air, turning its head in a jerky, insect-like motion until its milky eyes fixed on me. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "Thomas," it rasped, "I've been waiting for you." The creature, the Wendigo, my dream had named it, knew my name. Fear froze me in place as it took a step forward. "How do you know me?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible. The thing's mouth stretched into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "I know all who enter my forest. I've watched you, Thomas Davis, weekend after weekend, venturing deeper, testing your limits." It took another step. "I admire your spirit. It will taste all the sweeter for it." Ranger barked furiously, positioning himself between me and the creature. The Wendigo hissed, revealing more of those terrible teeth. "Your companion is brave," it said. "The last one I took ran whimpering into the woods." "Last one?" The boot on the trail flashed through my mind. "Jeremy Coldwell," I said, remembering the name from my dream. The creature's head snapped up, its expression changing to one of surprised rage. "That name no longer has power here," it snarled. "I am hunger. I am the drought bringer. I am the winter that walks." It lunged forward with supernatural speed. Ranger intercepted it, sinking his teeth into the creature's wiry leg. The Wendigo shrieked, a sound like metal grinding on metal, and swatted Ranger aside. My dog hit the trunk of the pine with a yelp and crumpled to the ground. Pure instinct took over. I unsheathed my hunting knife and charged, driving the blade deep into the Wendigo's side. The creature howled, its claws raking across my chest. Pain exploded through me as the fabric of my jacket tore and blood welled from 4 deep gashes. The Wendigo staggered back, black ichor oozing from its wound. It looked at me with something like respect in its cloudy eyes. "You fight well, Thomas Davis," it wheezed, "but you cannot kill hunger." "Maybe not," I gasped, clutching my bleeding chest, "but I can sure as hell make it hurt." I lunged again, this time driving my knife into the creature's throat. More of the black fluid gushed out, sizzling where it hit the ground. The Wendigo made a horrible gargling sound and fell to its knees. Taking my chance, I scrambled over to Ranger, who was struggling to stand. I helped him up, relieved to find he could walk, though he favored his right side. "Let's go, boy," I urged, casting a fearful glance at the Wendigo, which was clawing at the knife still embedded in its throat. We fled the clearing, crashing through the underbrush. I had no idea which direction led back to the trail, focused only on putting distance between us and that nightmarish creature. The forest seemed to work against us, branches reaching out to snag my clothing, roots rising to trip my feet, the ground becoming increasingly unstable. Behind us, I could hear the Wendigo recovering, its unearthly shriek echoing through the trees. The sound gave me a fresh burst of speed despite the burning pain in my chest. After what seemed like an eternity of panicked flight, we stumbled onto a trail. Not the one we'd been following earlier, but a trail nonetheless. Half carrying Ranger, who was beginning to lag, I followed it blindly. The day grew darker as clouds rolled in, threatening another storm. The temperature dropped further, and my breath came out in visible puffs. My wounds throbbed with each heartbeat, the front of my shirt now soaked with blood. The trail led us to a small wooden bridge spanning a rushing stream. On the other side stood a figure, human this time, an elderly man in a Maine Forest Service uniform. He waved urgently. "Hurry, son," he called. "Get across." I didn't question the miraculous appearance of help. I staggered forward, Ranger limping beside me. As we crossed the bridge, I glanced back and saw the Wendigo emerge from the tree line. It stopped at the edge of the stream, hissing in frustration. The forest ranger pulled me the last few feet across the bridge. "Running water," he explained, nodding toward the creature. "One of the few things they won't cross." "They?" I gasped, collapsing onto a fallen log. "You're not the first to encounter old Jeremy," the ranger said grimly, "though you're one of the few to walk away." The ranger, who introduced himself as Frank Matheson, had worked in Baxter State Park for over 40 years. He told me he'd been tracking the Wendigo's activities since finding a group of hikers torn apart near Chimney Pond a decade ago. "The drought makes it bolder," he explained as he dressed my wounds with supplies from his pack. "More desperate. In normal years it stays deep in the backcountry, picking off the occasional solo hiker or lost camper. But 3 hikers have gone missing in the last month alone." "Why doesn't anyone know about this?" I asked, wincing as he applied antiseptic to the gashes. "Why isn't the park closed?" Frank's weathered face tightened. "I filed reports, taken photographs of the evidence. No one believes me. They blame animal attacks, exposure, hikers' poor planning, easier than accepting that something from old nightmares stalks these woods." He examined Ranger next, gently probing his ribs. "Your dog's got a couple of cracked ribs, but he'll heal. You both need proper medical attention." "How do we get out of here?" I asked, eyeing the darkening sky. "I don't even know where we are anymore." "We're on the northern boundary of the park," Frank said. "My cabin's about 2 miles from here. We can shelter there tonight, then I'll drive you both to Millinocket in the morning." As we prepared to leave, I glanced back across the stream. The Wendigo stood there still, watching us with those hungry eyes. It raised a clawed hand in what almost seemed like a farewell gesture. "This isn't over, Thomas Davis," it called, its voice carrying easily over the rushing water. "Hunger is patient. Hunger can wait." Frank placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't listen to its lies. That's how it gets in your head." We made it to Frank's cabin just as twilight deepened into night. It was a sturdy structure with walls lined with books on folklore and the supernatural, interspersed with detailed maps of the park marked with red X's, locations of disappearances and suspected Wendigo activity. As Frank prepared a simple meal, I studied one of the maps. "There's a pattern," I observed. "It stays near Katahdin most of the time, but during droughts it ranges much farther." Frank nodded. The Abenaki believed that the Wendigo brought the drought with it, a manifestation of its insatiable hunger. The land starves along with the creature. "How do you kill it?" I asked. "I don't know that you can," Frank admitted. "The old stories say fire, but I've tried that. It just comes back, season after season." He placed a steaming bowl of stew in front of me. "Best we can do is warn people, help them stay safe until the rains return and drive it back into hibernation." That night, as Ranger slept fitfully beside my cot, I dreamed again of the Wendigo. But this time, it wasn't chasing me. It was showing me visions of itself as a man, Jeremy Coldwell, lost and starving in the unforgiving Maine winter of 1887. I saw his desperate decision to feed on the flesh of his dead companion, felt the hunger grow rather than diminish with each bite, watched as humanity slipped away, replaced by an eternal, gnawing emptiness. I woke, gasping, tears streaming down my face. Ranger whined and pressed closer to me. "It wants to die," I whispered, the realization hitting me with absolute certainty. The next morning, Frank drove us to the hospital in Millinocket. The doctor who treated me seemed skeptical of my story about being attacked by a bear, but she didn't press the issue. Ranger was seen by a vet who confirmed Frank's diagnosis of cracked ribs and prescribed rest. When we were discharged that afternoon, Frank was waiting for us. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began as we walked to his truck. About it wanting to die. Maybe there's something to that. The hunger is its curse, I said. In my dream, I felt it. This overwhelming emptiness that can never be filled. What if that's the key? Not trying to destroy it, but to satisfy it somehow? Frank considered this. There's an Abenaki elder in Penobscot who might know more. I've consulted her before about the Wendigo legends. 2 days later, after Ranger and I had rested at my cabin, Frank took us to meet Sarah White Eagle, an elderly woman who lived in a modest home on the Penobscot Reservation. Her living room walls displayed beautiful traditional baskets and artwork alongside photographs of her extensive family. She listened intently as I described my encounter and subsequent dream, nodding occasionally. The Wendigo is trapped between worlds, she explained, her voice soft but firm. It cannot die because it cannot let go of its hunger. The man, Jeremy Coldwell, is still in there somewhere, cursed to watch as the hunger uses his form to commit atrocities. How do we free him? I asked. Sarah's dark eyes met mine. The old stories say that a Wendigo can only be released when it finds compassion in place of fear, and when it is offered that which it truly hungers for. And what's that? Frank asked. Peace, Sarah said simply. The true hunger of the Wendigo is for an end to its suffering. A plan began to form in my mind. A dangerous, possibly foolish plan. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was meant to encounter the Wendigo, that the creature had been calling to me specifically during all those weekends in the woods. 2 weeks later, with my wounds mostly healed and Ranger left safely at home, Frank and I returned to Baxter State Park. The drought had worsened. Numerous trails were now closed due to fire danger, but we received special permission due to Frank's ranger status. We headed directly for the lightning-scarred pine where I'd encountered the Wendigo, carrying only what we needed: food, water, medical supplies, and a few items suggested by Sarah White Eagle. The forest was silent as we approached the clearing, the usual wildlife conspicuously absent. The crude shelter still stood beneath the pine, but the hanging carcasses were gone, the bones scattered as if something had violently ransacked the area. "It knows we're here," Frank murmured, scanning the tree line. I nodded, my mouth too dry to speak. I removed my pack and began setting up what Sarah had described as a spirit feast. A small fire ringed with offerings of tobacco, sweetgrass, and small wooden carvings representing the animals of the forest. Around this, I placed photographs I'd brought, old black and white images of Millinocket and Baxter State Park from the late 1800s that Frank had found in the Historical Society archives. Images of the world Jeremy Coldwell would have known. As dusk fell, I added the final element, a small amount of my own blood, collected from a carefully made cut on my palm, dripped onto a flat stone placed in the center of the fire ring. "Blood, freely given," I said, repeating the words Sarah had taught me. "To remember what it means to be human." We lit the fire and waited. The flames burned normal orange-red this time, sending sparks floating up into the darkening sky. Hours passed. Frank dozed against a tree trunk while I kept watch, fighting my own exhaustion. Just when I began to think our plan had failed, the temperature plummeted. My breath clouded in front of me, and the fire dimmed as if suffocating. From the darkness beyond the clearing came a familiar rattling breath. The Wendigo emerged. More gaunt than before, the wound in its throat healed to an ugly scar. It stopped at the edge of the firelight, nostrils flaring as it scented the air. "Thomas Davis," it hissed. "You returned to me. Have you come to finish our game?" Frank startled awake, reaching for his rifle, but I placed a restraining hand on his arm. "I came to talk, Jeremy," I said, using the creature's human name deliberately. The Wendigo flinched as if struck. "That name has no meaning," it growled, but there was uncertainty in its voice. "It's your name," I insisted, standing slowly. "Jeremy Coldwell. You were a prospector. You were lost in these woods in the winter of 1887. Stop." The command was part snarl, part plea. I took a careful step toward the creature, then another. I know you're suffering. I know the hunger never stops. I felt it in my dreams. The Wendigo's milky eyes widened. You saw? I nodded. I saw everything. What happened wasn't your fault, Jeremy. You were starving, desperate. I was weak, the creature spat. I gave in to the hunger. You were human, I countered, and somewhere inside that thing you've become, there's still a human man who suffered for over 130 years. I gestured to the photographs arranged around the fire. The Wendigo's gaze followed my movement, fixing on the images with something like longing. This was your world, I said softly. These were your mountains, your forests. Slowly, hesitantly, the Wendigo approached the fire. It crouched to examine the photographs, one clawed finger hovering just above the surface of an image showing Millinocket's Main Street, circa 1885. I remember, it whispered, its voice suddenly more human. Frank and I exchanged glances. This was the moment Sarah had described, when the human consciousness might briefly overcome the Wendigo curse. With deliberate movements, I took the stone with my blood from the center of the fire ring. It was warm in my palm. Jeremy Coldwell, I said formally, I offer you peace, blood freely given, not taken, an end to hunger. The creature looked up at me, and for an instant, I saw a human face superimposed over the monstrous features, a bearded man with desperate eyes. You would help me? The voice cracked with disbelief. Yes, I said simply. A tremor ran through the Wendigo's emaciated frame. It reached out with one clawed hand, palm up, an unmistakably human gesture. I placed the stone in its palm and stepped back. The Wendigo stared at the small offering for a long moment. Then, with a movement almost too fast to follow, it brought the stone to its mouth and swallowed it whole. For several seconds, nothing happened. The creature remained crouched by the fire, head bowed. Then it threw back its head and emitted a sound like nothing I'd ever heard, part scream, part sigh of relief. The Wendigo's body began to change, the antlers crumbling away like dried clay, the stretched skin shifting and settling into human proportions. Before our astonished eyes, the creature transformed into the translucent figure of a man, bearded, dressed in tattered 19th century clothing, his eyes now clear and human. Thank you, the ghost of Jeremy Coldwell whispered, his voice normal now, tinged with a hint of an old New England accent. He looked around the clearing one last time, his gaze lingering on the distant peak of Mount Katahdin, silhouetted against the night sky. Then he smiled, a genuine, peaceful expression, and his form dissolved into motes of light that scattered on the breeze and disappeared. Frank and I stood in stunned silence for several minutes after Jeremy's departure. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the forest lifted, and for the first time since entering the park, I heard the natural sounds of the woods, insects chirping, an owl hooting in the distance. 3 days later, as Frank and I hiked out of the park, a gentle rain began to fall. By the time we reached the ranger station, it had developed into a steady downpour, the first significant rainfall in months. I returned to my cabin and my life, but I was changed. Ranger recovered from his injuries, though he now growls at shadows and refuses to enter certain parts of the forest behind our home. I don't blame him. Some instincts are worth heeding. Frank still works as a ranger in Baxter State Park. We meet occasionally for coffee in Millinocket, comparing notes on strange occurrences in the deep woods. There have been no more disappearances, no more signs of the Wendigo. But sometimes, when the summer grows too hot and the land too dry, I find myself staring at the distant outline of Mount Katahdin, wondering if hunger can ever truly be satisfied, or if it merely waits for another opportunity to walk the world again. My name is Thomas Davis, and I am 34 years old. This happened in Baxter State Park, Maine, 3 summers ago, and I still don't know if I freed Jeremy Coldwell, or if he freed me. My name is Samantha Stewart, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Baxter State Park, Maine, just 3 weeks ago. "Come on, Sam, we're burning daylight," Megan called from up ahead, her blonde ponytail swinging as she navigated the uneven trail. I adjusted my backpack straps and quickened my pace, my boots crunching against the pine needles and rocks that littered the path. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. My best friend was already 20 feet ahead of me, full of the boundless energy I'd known her to have since our college days. "Some of us are carrying the tent," I called back, trying to mask the slight irritation in my voice. I wasn't out of shape, but the uphill climb combined with my 40-pound pack had my thighs burning. This hiking trip was Megan's idea. She'd convinced me that 3 days in Maine's wilderness would be the perfect way to clear our minds after a particularly brutal quarter at the marketing firm where we both worked. I'd been hesitant at first. Camping had never been my forte, but the promise of disconnecting from endless client emails and the suffocating pressure of deadlines had ultimately won me over. Our third companion, Eliza Carter, trailed a few feet behind me. While Megan and I had been friends since freshman year of college, Eliza was newer to our circle. A quiet, introspective woman from the accounting department who had joined our company about 6 months ago. When Megan had extended the invitation to her, I'd been surprised, but not displeased. There was something calming about Eliza's presence, and her unexpected knowledge of wilderness survival had already proven useful during our packing preparations. "The map shows a clearing about half a mile ahead," Eliza said, her voice soft yet carrying clearly through the still forest air. "Should be perfect for setting up camp before nightfall." I nodded, grateful for the update. We'd been hiking for nearly 6 hours, having started our trek at the Katahdin Stream campground early that morning. Our plan was to spend 3 days exploring some of the less traveled paths around Mount Katahdin, Maine's highest peak. As we continued our ascent, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to find a curious deer or perhaps another hiker. Each time, I saw nothing but the dense wall of pine and spruce that surrounded us. Just my imagination, I told myself, though the prickling sensation at the back of my neck persisted. The clearing, when we reached it, was perfect. A small, level area surrounded by a natural windbreak of tall evergreens. A nearby stream provided a source of fresh water, and a circle of stones indicated that other hikers had used this spot before us. "Home, sweet home," Megan announced, shrugging off her pack with a dramatic sigh of relief. "Told you this place would be worth the hike." We made quick work of setting up camp. Megan and I wrestled with the tent while Eliza gathered firewood and prepared a fire pit. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, we had a small but cheerful blaze going, and our tent was secured against the mild evening breeze. Dinner was a simple affair of dehydrated chili and instant coffee. As we sat around the fire, the conversation flowed easily, moving from office gossip to personal stories. Eliza, normally reserved, seemed to open up in the wilderness, sharing tales of her childhood camping trips with her father in the forests of northern Michigan. "He taught me everything I know about the outdoors," she said, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "How to track animals, which plants are edible, how to find your way when you're lost." She paused, a shadow crossing her face. "He disappeared during a solo hiking trip when I was 19. They never found his body." The abrupt silence that followed was heavy. Megan and I exchanged glances, neither of us quite sure how to respond. "I'm sorry," I finally said, reaching out to touch Eliza's arm gently. She shrugged, a forced smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It was a long time ago, but being out here, it makes me feel connected to him somehow, you know?" The conversation gradually recovered, but a subtle change had occurred. The forest around us seemed darker, the shadows deeper, the sounds of the wilderness more pronounced. As the fire died down to embers, we decided to turn in for the night. The inside of the tent was cramped but cozy. Megan took the middle, with Eliza and me on either side. Despite the exhaustion of the day's hike, sleep eluded me. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me straining to identify the source. Above us, through the mesh of the tent's roof panel, the stars were brilliant pinpricks of light in the vast Maine sky, untainted by city light pollution. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by Megan's hand on my shoulder. "Sam," she whispered, her voice tight with tension. "Do you hear that?" I blinked, disoriented, and then I heard it. A low, rhythmic thumping, like someone or something walking with a heavy gait around our campsite. My heart leaped into my throat. "Probably just a deer," I whispered back, not believing my own words. "That's not a deer," Eliza murmured from Megan's other side. She was sitting upright, her body rigid, head cocked to one side as she listened. The footsteps circled our tent once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped directly in front of the entrance. We held our breath, frozen in place. The silence stretched, unbearable in its intensity. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. A slow, deliberate zipper being pulled down. Our tent had an inner and outer layer, both with separate zippers. The outer one was moving. "What the fuck?" Megan hissed, scrambling backward, pressing against me. The zipper stopped halfway. We waited, hearts pounding in unison. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of retreating footsteps broke the stillness, fading into the forest. None of us slept for the remainder of the night. We sat huddled together, our flashlights ready, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally brightened the tent walls, we emerged cautiously, half expecting to find our campsite ransacked. Everything appeared untouched. There were no footprints around our tent, no evidence of the nighttime visitor. The only thing out of place was the outer zipper of our tent, hanging half open. "Maybe it was an animal," Megan suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "A curious bear or something." "Bears don't open zippers," Eliza replied quietly, her eyes scanning the tree line. "Well, I don't care what it was," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear that still gripped me. "I think we should head back to the campground." To my surprise, both Megan and Eliza disagreed. "We came all this way," Megan argued. "Are we really going to let one weird night ruin the entire trip?" "It was probably just another hiker playing a prank," Eliza reasoned. "These woods are more populated than they seem, especially this time of year." Outnumbered, I reluctantly agreed to continue as planned. We would spend the day hiking to Chimney Pond, a scenic lake cradled in the natural amphitheater of Mount Katahdin's slopes, then return to our campsite by nightfall. The hike helped calm my nerves. The beauty of the Maine wilderness was undeniable. Towering pines, crystal-clear streams, and the occasional glimpse of wildlife darting through the underbrush. By midday, the events of the previous night had receded to the back of my mind, overtaken by the physical demands of the trail and the majesty of our surroundings. We reached Chimney Pond shortly after noon. The sight was breathtaking, a pristine alpine lake surrounded by the dramatic slopes of Katahdin, its waters reflecting the cloud-strewn sky above. We found a spot on a sun-warmed rock to eat our lunch of energy bars and dried fruit. "Worth it, right?" Megan nudged me, her earlier enthusiasm fully restored. I had to admit it was. The tension of the morning had dissipated, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and awe at the natural beauty surrounding us. Even Eliza seemed more relaxed, sketching the landscape in a small notebook she had pulled from her pack. It was during our return journey that things began to take a darker turn. We had been hiking for about an hour when Eliza, who was leading the way, suddenly stopped. "Do you smell that?" she asked, her nose wrinkled in disgust. I inhaled deeply, immediately regretting it. The air carried a foul odor, metallic, rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. "Probably a dead animal nearby," Megan said, covering her nose with the collar of her shirt. "Let's keep moving," I suggested, eager to leave the stench behind. As we continued, The smell intensified rather than faded. And then, just off the trail, we saw it. A small deer, or what remained of one. Its body had been torn open, entrails spilled across the forest floor. But it wasn't the carnage that chilled me to the bone. It was the precision of it. The deer hadn't been mauled by a predator. It had been cut open with something sharp, its organs arranged in a deliberate pattern around the corpse. Jesus Christ, Megan gasped, turning away. Eliza stared at the macabre scene, her expression unreadable. "We need to go," she said finally. "Now." We picked up our pace, no longer stopping to admire the scenery or take photos. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt oppressive, the dense trees closing in around us, the shadows harboring unseen threats. The sun was beginning its descent when we arrived back at our campsite. Everything appeared as we had left it, yet something felt different, wrong. It took me a moment to realize what it was: the silence. The forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, just a heavy, expectant silence. "I don't like this," I whispered, as if afraid to disturb the unnatural stillness. "It's getting dark," Eliza said, her voice equally low. "We should get a fire going." We moved mechanically, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Megan collected kindling while Eliza and I arranged the stones around the fire pit. As I bent down to place a rock, I noticed something carved into one of the logs we had sat on the previous night. Fresh marks that hadn't been there before. 3 stick figures, crude but unmistakable, with X's where their eyes should be. My heart hammering against my ribs, I showed the others. "Okay, that's it," Megan declared, her face pale. "I'm calling Park Services." She pulled out her phone, then frowned. "No service. I had at least 1 bar this morning." Eliza and I checked our phones as well. No signal. The forest seemed to be closing in around us, the trees now sentinels keeping us trapped within their domain. "Maybe we should pack up and try to hike out tonight," I suggested, my voice betraying my fear. Eliza shook her head. "It'll be completely dark in less than an hour. Trying to navigate these trails at night would be suicide." "So what? We just sit here and wait for whoever carved those figures to come back?" Megan's voice had risen, edged with hysteria. "We stay alert," Eliza replied firmly. "Take watches through the night. I have a hunting knife in my pack." She hesitated, then added, "And we should consider the possibility that someone is targeting us specifically." "What do you mean?" I demanded. "The figures, 3 of them, just like us. This doesn't feel random." The implication hung in the air between us. Who would target 3 women on a hiking trip? And why? Despite our unease, we managed to get a fire going as darkness fell. None of us had much of an appetite, but we forced ourselves to eat some trail mix and jerky, knowing we needed to keep our strength up. We agreed to take 3-hour watches, with Eliza volunteering for the first shift. "Try to get some sleep," she told Megan and me as we prepared to enter the tent. "I'll wake you if anything happens." Inside the tent, Megan and I lay side by side, too wired to sleep despite our exhaustion. "This was a mistake," Megan whispered after several minutes of silence. "I shouldn't have pushed for this trip." "It's not your fault," I assured her, though part of me did blame her stubborn insistence on continuing after the previous night's incident. "There's something off about these woods," she continued, as if she hadn't heard me. "Something wrong." I couldn't disagree. From the moment we had discovered the mutilated deer, a sense of wrongness had settled over me, a feeling that we had unwittingly stumbled into something dark and malevolent. Despite my racing thoughts, exhaustion eventually pulled me under. My dreams were fragmented, unsettling, running through endless woods, pursued by a figure I couldn't quite see. The deer, its entrails spelling out a message I couldn't read. Eliza, standing over me with her hunting knife, her eyes replaced by black X's like the stick figures on the log. I jolted awake to the sound of Megan's scream. The tent was empty beside me. Outside, the fire had died to embers, casting a feeble glow over the clearing. I scrambled out, heart in my throat. "Megan! Eliza!" I called, my voice swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No answer. The clearing was deserted. Their backpacks were still there, as were their sleeping bags inside the tent, but my friends had vanished. "Megan!" I shouted again, louder this time, panic rising like bile in my throat. "Eliza!" A rustle from the trees to my right made me whirl around. A figure emerged from the darkness. Eliza, her face ashen in the dying firelight. "Where's Megan?" I demanded, relief at seeing her quickly replaced by concern for our missing friend. "I don't know," Eliza replied, her voice strained. "I went to gather more firewood, and when I came back, both of you were gone. I've been looking for the past 20 minutes. "I was asleep in the tent," I said, confusion and fear making my voice sharp. "Megan was with me. Where were you? You were supposed to be on watch." "The fire was dying," she explained, though something in her tone didn't ring true. "I only went a short distance. I was gone for 5 minutes, 10 at most." Before I could question her further, a scream pierced the night, distant but unmistakably Megan's. We plunged into the forest in the direction of the sound, our flashlights cutting weak paths through the oppressive darkness. The trees seemed to shift around us, the trail disappearing and reappearing, leading us deeper into the wilderness. "Megan!" I called repeatedly, my voice growing hoarse. We had been searching for what felt like hours when Eliza suddenly stopped, grabbing my arm. "Listen," she whispered. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. At first, nothing, then faintly, sobbing. Following the sound, we pushed through a dense thicket and emerged into another clearing, smaller than our campsite. In its center, illuminated by our flashlights, was Megan. She was kneeling on the ground, her back to us, her body racked with sobs. Relief flooded through me. "Megan!" I called, starting toward her. "Thank God! Are you hurt? What happened?" She didn't respond or turn around. Her sobs continued, monotonous and eerie in their regularity. I approached slowly, the relief giving way to a creeping unease. Something wasn't right about the way she was kneeling, too still despite her crying. "Megan?" I reached out to touch her shoulder. She turned then, and I stumbled backward with a choked scream. It was Megan's face, but her eyes. Her eyes were gone, replaced by empty, bloodied sockets that wept crimson tears down her cheeks. "You left me," she said, her voice distorted, guttural. "You both left me, and they found me." I backed away, unable to process the horror before me. "Eliza!" I gasped, turning to look for my companion. But Eliza wasn't behind me. Standing in her place was a figure I hadn't seen before. Tall, emaciated, with limbs too long for its torso. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out the gleam of eyes watching me with malevolent intelligence. The thing that had been Megan rose to her feet with unnatural, jerky movements. "They want you too, Sam," she said, taking a step toward me. "They want to show you things. Beautiful, terrible things." I ran. Blind with terror, I crashed through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. Behind me, I could hear pursuit. Not just one set of footsteps, but many, moving with a speed and coordination that no human could match. I had no sense of direction, no plan beyond putting distance between myself and the nightmare I'd witnessed. My lungs burned, my legs threatened to give out, but fear drove me onward. It was the sound of rushing water that eventually oriented me. The stream near our campsite. If I could find it, I could find my way back, grab my pack, and hopefully find the trail that would lead back to civilization. Following the sound, I broke through the trees and found myself on the bank of the stream. But it wasn't the gentle flow we had camped beside. This was a roaring torrent, swollen far beyond what was natural, its waters black in the moonlight. And standing on the opposite bank was Eliza. She stood perfectly still, watching me with an unreadable expression. Even across the rushing water, I could see that something was wrong with her face. It seemed to shift subtly, as if her features were rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. "You need to cross, Samantha," she called, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the sound of the water. "It's safer on this side. They can't follow you here." Every instinct screamed at me not to trust her, not to cross the water. Yet what choice did I have? The sounds of pursuit were growing closer, and whatever was hunting me through the forest was far more terrifying than the woman standing across the stream. I searched desperately for a way across, finding a series of partially submerged rocks that formed a precarious path. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the first stone. The water was ice cold, numbing my feet even through my hiking boots. The rocks were slippery, and the current pulled at me insistently, threatening to drag me under. I was halfway across when I looked up and saw that Eliza was gone. In her place stood the tall, emaciated figure I had glimpsed in the clearing. Even without seeing its face clearly, I knew it was smiling. I froze, caught between the horrors behind me and the monstrosity ahead. In that moment of hesitation, my foot slipped on the mossy surface of the rock. I fell backward, the cold water enveloping me, the current instantly pulling me under. The shock of the freezing water paralyzed me momentarily. By the time I fought my way to the surface, gasping for air, the current had already carried me several yards downstream. I thrashed, trying to swim toward the bank, but the torrent was too powerful. Rocks battered my body as I was swept along, each impact sending jolts of pain through my already exhausted frame. Just as my strength was about to give out, my hand struck something solid, a log that had fallen across part of the stream. I clung to it, using the last reserves of my energy to pull myself toward the shore. Collapsing on the muddy bank, I lay there for several minutes, coughing up water, every muscle screaming in protest. The night was silent now, except for the sound of the stream and my own ragged breathing. Had I lost my pursuers? As if in answer to my unspoken question, a twig snapped nearby. I froze, not daring to move or even breathe. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, silhouetted against the darkness. Not the emaciated creature, not the thing that had been Megan, but a man, ordinary in appearance, dressed in flannel and jeans that could belong to any hiker or local. His face was weather-beaten, lined with age and exposure to the elements. He held a lantern in one hand, its warm glow a stark contrast to the cold moonlight. "You took quite a tumble in that stream, miss," he said, his voice carrying a thick Maine accent. "Lucky you didn't drown." I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain that shot through my bruised body. "Who are you?" I demanded, ready to flee again if necessary. "Name's Harold Winters," he replied, taking a cautious step toward me. "I have a cabin about half a mile from here, heard the commotion and came to investigate." He peered at me more closely. "You're in a bad way. Hypothermia's a real risk in these parts, even in summer. Waters come straight down from the mountain." I hesitated, torn between fear of this stranger and the knowledge that I wouldn't survive the night without help. My clothes were soaked, the temperature was dropping, and I had no supplies, no sense of direction. "I'm not alone," I said, trying to make my voice stronger than I felt. "I have friends nearby." The lie was transparent, but it was all the protection I could muster. Harold's expression didn't change. "No, you don't," he said simply. "Whatever you were with, they weren't your friends. Not anymore." A chill that had nothing to do with my wet clothes ran down my spine. "What do you mean? What's happening in these woods?" He sighed, suddenly looking much older. "It's a long story, and this ain't the place to tell it. You coming with me or not? Decision's yours, but I wouldn't recommend staying out here after what you've seen." What choice did I have? I nodded, and he turned, indicating I should follow him. We moved through the forest in silence, the lantern's glow creating a small bubble of light around us. I kept a few paces behind him, ready to run if he made any threatening move. The cabin, when we reached it, was small but solid. A simple one-room structure built of logs and river stone. Inside was sparse but comfortable. A wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves lined with books, preserved foods, and various tools. Harold gestured to a chest at the foot of the bed. "There's dry clothes in there. They'll be too big, but they're warm. Get changed while I stoke the fire." I waited until he had his back turned before quickly peeling off my wet garments and pulling on the offered clothing. A flannel shirt and wool pants that hung off my frame but were blissfully dry. The warmth of the cabin began to seep into my chilled bones as Harold busied himself at the stove, soon producing a pot of strong-smelling tea. "Drink," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "It'll help with the cold." The tea was bitter but warming. As the heat spread through my body, the events of the night crashed over me anew. Megan's eyeless face, Eliza's betrayal, the creature in the woods. Tears sprang to my eyes and my hands began to shake. "What happened to my friends?" I asked, my voice breaking. Harold settled into the chair across from me, his weathered face grave in the firelight. "They were taken," he said simply, "by what folks around here call the Wendigo." "The Wendigo," I repeated, the term vaguely familiar from old horror stories. "That's a myth, a Native American legend. Call it what you want, legend, myth, curse. Doesn't change what it is or what it does." He took a sip of his own tea. "Been haunting these parts of Maine for as long as anyone can remember. Most times it sleeps, but every so often it wakes and hungers." "For what?" I whispered, though part of me already knew the answer. "Souls," Harold replied. "It takes people, wears their skins for a while, uses them to lure others. What you saw, your friends, that wasn't them anymore. Just shells the Wendigo was using." The explanation was too fantastic, too horrible to be real. And yet, after what I had witnessed, I found myself believing it. "The deer," I said suddenly. "We found a deer, cut open, its organs arranged around it." Harold nodded grimly. "That's how it marks its hunting ground. A warning, if you know how to read it. Why didn't you leave, if you know what's out there?" "This land has been in my family for generations," he said, a hint of defiance in his tone. "Besides, someone needs to warn folks like you, though most don't listen until it's too late." I thought of Eliza's father, who had disappeared in the wilderness years ago. Had he encountered the same horror? Had Eliza known what waited for us in these woods? The thought made my stomach turn. "How do we stop it?" I asked. "How do we get my friends back?" Harold's laugh was bitter. "We don't. What's taken is taken. The best we can do is survive until it goes back to sleep." "And when will that be?" "When it's had its fill. Or—" He hesitated, then reached for a book on one of the shelves. It was old, its leather binding cracked with age. Opening it carefully, he showed me a page of handwritten text in fading ink. "My great-grandfather wrote this. He claimed to have fought the Wendigo and driven it back into hibernation with this ritual." The page detailed an ancient ceremony, a combination of Native American and early settler traditions. It involved specific herbs, a special fire, and what appeared to be a blood sacrifice. "This can't be real," I murmured. Though after everything I'd seen, my skepticism felt hollow. "Real enough that my great-grandfather believed in it," Harold replied, closing the book. "Real enough that I keep these herbs dried and ready." He nodded toward bundles of dried plants hanging from the rafters. We fell into silence, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin's timbers. Outside, the wind had picked up, whistling around the eaves with an almost human quality that set my teeth on edge. "Try to get some sleep," Harold finally said, nodding toward the bed. "I'll keep watch." Exhaustion pulled at me, but the thought of closing my eyes, of being vulnerable, terrified me. What if they come here? What if they find us? "The cabin's protected," he assured me, pointing to symbols carved into the doorframe that I hadn't noticed before. Old magic, older than the Wendigo itself. "We're safe here, at least for tonight." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. I moved to the bed, sinking onto its rough blankets, my body aching from the night's ordeal. Despite my fear, my eyelids grew heavy. The last thing I saw before sleep claimed me was Harold sitting by the fire, a shotgun across his knees, his eyes fixed on the door as if daring the horrors of the forest to try to enter his domain. I awoke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window. For a moment, disoriented, I thought the events of the previous night had been a nightmare. Then the aches in my body reminded me otherwise. Harold was at the stove, frying something that smelled surprisingly good. He nodded when he saw I was awake. Feeling better? Physically, maybe, I admitted, sitting up. Every muscle protested the movement. What happens now? We eat, he said practically. Then we talk about getting you out of these woods. Breakfast was simple but filling. Venison, fried potatoes, strong black coffee. I ate mechanically, hunger overriding the nausea that thoughts of the previous night induced. The nearest ranger station is about 10 miles south, Harold explained as we ate. Under normal circumstances, I'd say you could make it by nightfall. But with the Wendigo awake, he shook his head. It's risky. What's the alternative? Stay here? For a few days, maybe. Sometimes they lose interest if they can't find their prey. Move on to easier targets. The thought of hiding while the creatures that had once been my friends hunted other innocent hikers made my stomach turn. And if they don't lose interest? Harold's eyes met mine, grave and knowing. Then we try the ritual. The decision was made for us shortly after breakfast. Harold was checking his traps near the cabin when he returned, his face grim. "They're coming," he said without preamble. "Found sign of them not half a mile from here. Fresh, too." My heart sank. "How many?" "3 that I could track. Your friends, and something else. Something bigger." He began gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. His shotgun, ammunition, a hunting knife, the book containing the ritual, bundles of the dried herbs. "We need to move. The symbols on the cabin will hold them off for a while, but not indefinitely." "Where are we going?" I asked, helping him pack the supplies into a worn backpack. "Blackwater Cliff," he replied. "It's the highest point in this part of the forest. The ritual needs to be performed at elevation, and the terrain will make it harder for them to surround us." We left within minutes, Harold leading the way through the forest with a sureness that spoke of decades of experience. The day was bright, the sky a clear, mocking blue above the canopy of trees. It was hard to believe that such horror could exist under the benign summer sun. "How far is this cliff?" I asked as we navigated a particularly dense thicket. "About 4 miles as the crow flies. Longer the way we're going. Have to circle around Devil's Bog. No one goes through there, not even the Wendigo." "Why not?" Harold's expression darkened. "Some places are cursed in ways even the spirits fear. That bog's been poisoned since the mill accident in '67. Chemicals leached into the groundwater, killed everything for miles around. Nothing grows there now. Nothing lives. Even the Wendigo avoids it. Can't possess what isn't alive." The detour added hours to our journey. By midday, the temperature had risen, and sweat soaked my borrowed clothes. Harold maintained a punishing pace, stopping only briefly to consult his compass or study the terrain ahead. It was during one of these brief rests that we heard it. A long, keening howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was not the sound of any natural animal. It vibrated with a hatred and hunger that was unmistakably sentient. "They've found our trail," Harold said grimly, checking his shotgun. "We need to move faster." We half ran through the forest, no longer bothering with stealth. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on my back, sense the malevolence that pursued us. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. A flash of pale skin, the unnatural elongation of a limb, a face that shifted between human and something other. Blackwater Cliff, when we finally reached it, was imposing, a sheer rock face rising about 100 feet above the surrounding forest. A narrow, winding path led to its summit. Up, Harold commanded, waving me ahead of him. I'll cover our rear. The climb was treacherous, the path barely wide enough for one person in places, the drop to one side growing more fatal with each step upward. My hands were soon scraped raw from gripping the rocks for balance, my legs trembling with exertion. The summit was a flat expanse of stone about 30 feet in diameter. From this height, I could see for miles, the endless green of the Maine wilderness stretching to the horizon, unmarred by any sign of human habitation. Under different circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking. Harold wasted no time. From his pack, he produced the dried herbs, arranging them in a specific pattern on the stone surface. In the center, he placed a small animal skull, a rabbit or squirrel perhaps, and around it, he poured a circle of what looked like salt mixed with a dark, reddish powder. "Is that blood?" I asked, my voice catching. "Mine," he confirmed, showing me a small cut on his palm I hadn't noticed before. "The ritual requires a sacrifice. Blood freely given." As he worked, I kept watch on the path we had ascended. The forest had gone silent again, that unnatural stillness that preceded the appearance of the Wendigo and its puppets. "They're coming," I warned, spotting movement among the trees at the base of the cliff. Harold nodded, not looking up from his preparations. "The fire needs to be lit at the exact moment they arrive. Not before, not after." He handed me a box of matches. "When I give the word, light the herbs. Not before. Understand?" I nodded, my hand shaking as I took the matches. Harold positioned himself at the edge of the cliff, shotgun ready. They emerged from the forest in a grotesque procession, the things that had once been Megan and Eliza in the lead, followed by the emaciated creature I had glimpsed the night before. In the daylight, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, skin stretched taut over visible bone, its fingers ending in curved claws that scraped against the stone as it moved. But it was the face that froze my blood, human in shape but wrong in every detail, with eyes like black pits and a mouth that split its face in a grin too wide filled with needle-like teeth. Megan and Eliza had changed since I'd last seen them. Their movements were jerky, puppet-like, as if their bodies were being controlled by someone who didn't quite understand how human anatomy worked. Megan's eyeless face was turned upward, somehow tracking our position despite her blindness. Eliza's features continued to shift and flow, never quite settling into a recognizable expression. "Not yet," Harold murmured as I reached for the matches. "Wait until they're on the path." The trio paused at the base of the cliff, as if conferring. Then, with impossible speed, they began to ascend. Not taking the path, but scaling the sheer rock face, fingers and toes finding holds where none should exist. "Light it," Harold commanded, raising his shotgun. "Now!" I struck a match with trembling fingers, touching it to the arranged herbs. They caught immediately, the flame burning with an unnatural bluish tint and releasing a pungent smoke that made my eyes water. Harold began to chant, his words in a language I didn't recognize. Guttural, ancient-sounding syllables that seemed to vibrate in the air. The ascending creatures faltered, hissing in apparent pain or anger. The emaciated one, the true Wendigo, I now realized, let out that same keening howl I had heard in the forest, a sound of rage and hunger denied. Harold's chanting grew louder, more insistent. He drew his hunting knife and, without hesitation, drew it across his forearm, letting his blood drip into the burning herbs. The smoke turned from blue to a deep crimson red, coiling upward in unnatural spirals. The Wendigo shrieked, its claws digging into the rock face so deeply that pieces of stone broke away, tumbling to the ground below. It began to climb faster, its movements frenzied, desperate. "The chant," Harold gasped, his voice strained. "Repeat after me." He spoke words I couldn't possibly pronounce, but I tried, my clumsy tongue struggling with the alien syllables. To my surprise, they came more easily with each repetition, as if the words themselves were teaching me how to speak them. The air around us began to shimmer, the temperature dropping rapidly despite the summer heat. My breath fogged in front of my face, and frost began to form on the stone beneath our feet. The Wendigo was now only yards away, its puppet versions of my friends close behind. Harold raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing across the wilderness. The shot hit the creature in the shoulder, tearing away chunks of its desiccated flesh, but it didn't slow its advance. "Keep chanting," Harold shouted, firing again. This time, he aimed for the thing that had been Megan. The shot caught her in the chest, the impact sending her falling backward, tumbling down the cliff face with a sickening series of crunches. Eliza, or what remained of her, reached the edge of the cliff, pulling herself onto the summit with inhuman strength. Her face had settled into a nightmarish approximation of a smile, her eyes now solid black like the Wendigo's. "Samantha," she said, her voice a discordant chorus of Eliza's and something else, something ancient and malevolent. "Why do you fight us? We only want to show you wonders beyond your imagination." "That's not Eliza," Harold reminded me sharply. "Don't listen to it," I continued the chant, my voice growing stronger even as tears streamed down my face. The smoke from the burning herbs had formed a swirling barrier around us, a vortex of crimson that seemed to push against the advancing creatures. The Wendigo finally reached the summit, its black eyes fixed on Harold with a hatred so intense it was almost tangible. With a motion almost too fast to follow, it lunged toward him. Harold fired his last shot, catching the creature in its skeletal chest, but it didn't stop. Its clawed hand swept out, catching Harold across the throat. Blood sprayed, bright red against the stone. Harold fell, the shotgun clattering from his grip. His eyes met mine, wide with pain and desperation. "Finish it," he gasped, blood bubbling from his lips. His hand fumbled at his belt, drawing out his hunting knife. With his last strength, he slid it across the stone toward me. The Wendigo turned its attention to me, its mouth splitting in that impossible grin. Behind it, the thing that had been Eliza advanced, moving with the jerky, broken gait of a marionette with tangled strings. I snatched up the knife, my mind racing. The ritual needed a blood sacrifice. Harold's death wouldn't count. It had to be freely given. With a silent prayer, I drew the blade across my palm, the pain sharp but distant through the haze of terror. My blood dripped onto the burning herbs, joining Harold's. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The smoke vortex expanded explosively, engulfing the Wendigo and the creature that had been Eliza. Their screams rose in a terrible harmony, filled with rage and something that might have been fear. I continued the chant, the words coming automatically now, as if something else were speaking through me. The temperature dropped further, ice crystals forming in the air around us. The Wendigo thrashed within the smoke, its form seeming to flicker and distort, becoming less substantial with each passing second. The thing that had been Eliza lunged at me, breaking through the smoke barrier. Its hands, no longer even remotely human, closed around my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak to continue the chant. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. With the last of my strength, I plunged Harold's knife into its chest. It wasn't a calculated move, just blind desperation. The creature released me, stumbling backward. For an instant, I saw Eliza in its face, the real Eliza, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. "Sam," she whispered, her voice her own again. "What's happening? Where are we?" Before I could respond, her body was yanked backward as if pulled by invisible strings. She was engulfed by the smoke vortex, joining the Wendigo in its thrashing death throes. I resumed the chant, my voice hoarse, my throat bruised from the creature's grip. The wind picked up, howling around the summit with hurricane force. The smoke condensed, shrinking inward, compressing around the Wendigo and what remained of Eliza. There was a final, ear-splitting shriek, a sound of such primal anguish that I fell to my knees, covering my ears. The smoke imploded with a thunderclap, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Where the Wendigo had stood was nothing but a small pile of what looked like ash, gray and lifeless on the stone. Of Eliza there was no sign. Harold lay where he had fallen, eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. I crawled to him, closing his eyes gently. "Thank you," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I don't remember much of what followed. I gathered what supplies I could from Harold's pack and made my way down the cliff. The forest felt different now, still and peaceful, the oppressive wrongness gone. Using Harold's compass, I headed south, walking through the night, too afraid to stop. I was found the next morning by a park ranger on routine patrol near the outer boundaries of Baxter State Park. My story was met with skepticism, of course. The official explanation was that my friends and I had been attacked by a bear or mountain lion, that I had become separated and suffered hallucinations due to trauma and exposure. They found our original campsite, the tent still standing, our supplies untouched. Of Megan and Eliza, there was no trace. No bodies were ever recovered. Harold's cabin, when I tried to lead them to it, couldn't be found. It was as if it had never existed. The rangers attributed my confused directions to disorientation. After all, Baxter State Park covers over 200,000 acres of wilderness. It would be easy to lose your bearings, especially after such a traumatic experience. I've spent the 3 weeks since then trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched the Wendigo legend, finding disturbing parallels to what I experienced. I've looked into missing persons reports in the Baxter State Park area over the past century. There are dozens, many never resolved. Most unsettling of all, I found an obituary from 1978 for Harold Winters, a local guide and hermit who lived in the Katahdin region all his life. The cause of death was listed as a hunting accident. He was survived by no one. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't lived through it. All I know is that something ancient and malevolent lives in those woods, something that can wear the faces of those you love, something that never stops hunting once it has your scent. I won't be going back to Maine. I won't be going camping or hiking anywhere ever again. But sometimes, in my dreams, I see Eliza's face in that final moment, confused, human, herself again, and I wonder if part of her is still out there in those woods, still trapped by whatever horror claimed her. And sometimes, when I wake in the dead of night, I could swear I hear a keening howl in the distance, even through the walls of my apartment in Boston, hundreds of miles from those cursed woods, as if it's calling to me, as if it's still hunting, as if it's getting closer. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 36 years old. This happened in the isolated wilderness surrounding Eden Falls, a little-known area deep within Maine's 100-mile wilderness. I've played this nightmare over in my mind countless times since then, trying to convince myself there's a rational explanation for what happened to us. There isn't. Chris, Naveen, and I had been friends since our freshman year of college. Through marriages, divorces, career changes, and life's many crises, our annual camping trip had remained sacred. 1 week away from responsibilities and technology, just 3 friends reconnecting in the wilderness. This would be our 15th trip together, and we'd chosen Maine's most remote hiking region for the occasion. The 100-mile wilderness is the most isolated section of the Appalachian Trail, a vast stretch of untamed forest where hikers can go days without encountering another human being. Eden Falls wasn't even on most maps. Chris had learned about it from a local guide in Monson, the last town before entering the wilderness. It's about 12 miles east of the main trail, Chris explained as we gathered our gear from my SUV at the trailhead parking lot. The guy said hardly anyone goes there because it's tough to reach, but the falls are incredible. A 100-foot cascade into this pristine gorge with crystal-clear pools. "And good fishing?" Naveen asked, adjusting his pack. As a surgical resident, his rare time off was precious, and fishing was his form of meditation. "Supposedly, some of the best brook trout in Maine," Chris confirmed, "and we'll have it all to ourselves." I remember how excited we were as we shouldered our packs and set off down the trail. The October weather was perfect. Cool enough for comfortable hiking, but not cold enough to require heavy gear. The forest was ablaze with fall colors, maple and birch trees creating a canopy of gold and crimson above us. We spent the first day on the Maine Appalachian Trail, making good progress despite our laden packs. The familiar rhythm of hiking settled over us. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional call of a bird, the steady in and out of breath as we tackled the rolling terrain. We talked about our lives back home. Chris's software company was finally taking off after years of struggle. Naveen was in the final year of his surgical residency, exhausted but fulfilled. I shared stories about my work as an environmental consultant, currently assessing the impact of a proposed mining operation in northern Minnesota. We made camp that night at a designated site along the Maine Trail. As darkness fell, we sat around the fire passing a flask of whiskey between us, reminiscing about past trips. The easy camaraderie that had sustained our friendship for nearly 2 decades was as strong as ever. "Remember that bear in Glacier National Park?" Naveen asked, chuckling at the memory. Chris groaned. "How could I forget? I've never run so fast in my life." "It was just a black bear," I reminded them. "And it was more interested in our trail mix than in us." "Easy for you to say," Chris retorted. "You weren't the one who had to change your underwear afterward." We laughed, the sound echoing through the dark forest around us. In retrospect, I wonder if that was what first drew attention to us. Our laughter carrying too far, reaching ears that should never have heard human voices. The next morning, we left the Maine Trail, following the crude map the guide had drawn for Chris. The path, if you could call it that, was barely visible. Just a slight depression in the forest floor occasionally marked by old, faded blazes on trees. The terrain grew steeper and more challenging as we pushed eastward. Twice we lost the trail entirely and had to backtrack. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked after we'd been bushwhacking for over an hour. Chris consulted his map and compass. "Pretty sure. The guide said it's about 12 miles from the main trail, and we've gone maybe 8. Should start heading downhill soon toward the gorge." Naveen, who'd been unusually quiet all morning, suddenly stopped. "Do you smell that?" I inhaled deeply. There was an odd scent on the breeze. Sweet and pungent, like overripe fruit mixed with something else I couldn't identify. "Probably just a carcass somewhere," Chris suggested. "Something died in the woods." But the smell didn't fade as we continued. If anything, it grew stronger. And there was something else too, a subtle wrongness to the forest around us. The trees seemed somehow twisted, their trunks gnarled in unnatural ways. The undergrowth was thicker here, with plants I didn't recognize despite my background in environmental science. "Hey, check this out," Naveen called, pointing to a tree beside the path. Deep gouges marked its trunk, as if something with enormous claws had raked it repeatedly. The marks were recent, the exposed wood still pale. "Bear," Chris suggested, though he sounded uncertain. I examined the marks closely. They were too high for a bear, starting at least 8 feet up the trunk. And the pattern was wrong. 5 parallel lines, evenly spaced, with precision that seemed almost deliberate. "I don't think so," I said quietly. A hushed tension fell over us as we continued walking. The forest had gone strangely silent. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the air still and heavy around us. Then we heard it, the distant sound of falling water. Our spirits lifted instantly. "That's got to be it," Chris said, his pace quickening. "Eden Falls." We moved faster, eager to reach our destination after the unsettling hike. The path dipped sharply downward and we found ourselves descending into a ravine. The sound of water grew louder, and the sweet rot smell intensified until it was almost overpowering. The trees thinned, and suddenly we were standing at the edge of a gorge. Below us, a waterfall cascaded down a sheer rock face into a series of pools that stretched away into the distance. The scene should have been beautiful, but something was terribly wrong. The water wasn't clear as Chris had described. It was a deep, murky crimson, the color of old blood. The rocks around the pools were stained with it, and a thick, reddish mist hung in the air above the falls. The vegetation surrounding the water was bizarre, massive, mushroom-like growths that pulsed slightly as if breathing, and twisted vines covered in what looked like small, glistening eyes. "What the fuck?" Naveen whispered. "This can't be right," Chris said, pulling out his map again. "Maybe we took a wrong turn." But I knew we hadn't. This was Eden Falls, or what Eden Falls had become. As an environmental scientist, I'd seen plenty of pollution before, but nothing like this. This wasn't industrial runoff or agricultural waste. This was something else entirely. "We should take samples," I said automatically, professional instincts kicking in despite my unease. "Document this. Whatever's happening here needs to be reported." "Are you kidding?" Naveen stared at me. "We need to get the hell out of here." But Chris was already moving along the edge of the gorge. "There's a path down to the pools. Let's at least check it out before we leave. We hiked all this way." Naveen and I exchanged glances. There was a stubborn set to Chris's shoulders that we both recognized. Once he'd made up his mind, it was nearly impossible to dissuade him. "Fine," Naveen conceded, "but we don't touch that water, understand? Not until we know what's in it." We followed a narrow trail that zigzagged down the steep gorge wall. The reddish mist grew thicker as we descended, carrying that sweet rot smell so strongly I could taste it at the back of my throat. My skin felt damp, not with sweat but with a fine layer of moisture from the mist. At the bottom of the gorge, we stood at the edge of the largest pool, directly beneath the falls. Up close, the water was even more disturbing. Not just red, but moving in a way that water shouldn't, with slow, deliberate currents that seemed independent of the fall's flow. Occasionally, something large would disturb the surface from below, creating ripples that spread outward in perfect concentric circles. The strange vegetation was everywhere, those pulsing, mushroom-like growths ranging from the size of basketballs to larger than a car. They emitted the sweet rot smell, releasing spores that floated visibly in the mist. The vines with eye-like protrusions twisted slowly along the ground and up the rock walls, some reaching heights of 30 feet or more. "This is impossible," I murmured, struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with my scientific understanding of the world. "These plants shouldn't exist. Not in Maine, not anywhere." "Look," Chris said, pointing to the far side of the pool. "There's a cabin." Sure enough, partially hidden by the bizarre foliage, stood a small wooden structure. It looked old, but not abandoned. Thin wisps of smoke rose from a metal chimney, and what appeared to be fresh firewood was stacked against one wall. "Someone lives here?" Naveen sounded incredulous. "In this?" "Maybe they can tell us what happened to the falls," Chris suggested, already starting around the edge of the pool toward the cabin. I grabbed his arm. "Wait, we don't know who's in there or if they're safe." A look passed between us, an acknowledgement of the growing certainty that whatever had affected the water and plants might have affected any human inhabitants as well. But Chris shook off my hand. "We came all this way," he said firmly. "I want answers." Before Naveen or I could object further, Chris was picking his way around the pool's edge. After a moment's hesitation, we followed, staying well back from the water. The cabin stood about 20 yards from the pool's edge, a simple one-room structure built of rough-hewn logs. A small garden plot beside it contained more of the strange vegetation, these specimens smaller but apparently cultivated in neat rows. The cabin's single window was covered from the inside with what looked like black cloth, and the door was made of thick planks bound with iron. Chris approached confidently and knocked. "Hello? Anyone home?" No response. He knocked again, louder. "Hello? We're hikers, just passing through." Something scraped inside the cabin. A chair being pushed back, perhaps, or a heavy object dragged across the floor. Then, slowly, the door creaked open a few inches. A woman's face appeared in the gap. elderly, deeply lined, with pale eyes that seemed too large for her skull. Her skin had an unhealthy grayish tinge, and thin white hair hung in limp strands around her face. "No one passes through Eden Falls," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "What do you want here?" Chris, always the diplomat of our group, smiled reassuringly. "We heard about the falls from a guide in Monson. We were hoping to camp and fish for a few days, but we found—" He gestured toward the crimson pools. "This. Do you know what happened here?" The woman studied us for a long moment, her pale eyes moving from Chris to Naveen to me. Something in her gaze made my skin crawl, a hunger, an assessment, as if she were appraising livestock. Finally, she opened the door wider. "Come inside. Not safe to talk out here, not when the sun gets low." I checked my watch, 3:17 p.m. Hours of daylight left, yet the gorge was already deeply shadowed, the crimson mist seeming to thicken as evening approached. "We should keep moving," I murmured to the others. "Make camp somewhere else." "Don't be rude," Chris whispered back. "Besides, she might know a safer route back to the main trail." The woman had disappeared inside the cabin, leaving the door ajar. After a brief hesitation, Chris followed her in. Naveen glanced at me, shrugged, and went after him. Left with little choice, I trailed behind, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. The cabin's interior was dimly lit by a small fire in a stone hearth. Bundles of dried plants, none that I recognized, hung from the ceiling beams, and shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars containing dark liquid and floating objects I couldn't identify. A crude wooden table and 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, and a narrow bed stood against the far wall. The whole place smelled of the same sweet rot as outside, mixed with wood smoke and something metallic, like blood. "Sit," the woman commanded, gesturing to the table. "I'll make tea." We sat awkwardly while she busied herself at the hearth, filling a cast-iron kettle from a bucket of water. Clear water, I noted with relief, not the crimson liquid from the pools. As she worked, I studied her more carefully. Her movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as if she were a puppet controlled by unseen strings. And her hands. I tried not to stare, but her fingers were wrong. Too long, with an extra joint, the nails thick and curved like talons. She caught me looking and smiled, revealing teeth that had been filed to points. "Been alone too long," she said, misinterpreting my expression. "Forget my manners. Name's Abigail Thorne. Been at Eden Falls near 40 years now." "I'm Chris," my friend offered, "and this is Naveen and Michael. What happened to the falls, Miss Thorne? They're supposed to be clear water, good for fishing." Abigail's face twitched, something between a smile and a grimace. "Oh, they were. Long time ago. But the falls change. Everything changes when they come through." "They?" Naveen asked. "Who do you mean?" She placed 4 crude clay cups on the table and filled them with a steaming liquid the color of rust. "Drink. We'll talk." I stared at the cup before me, the steam carrying that same sweet rot smell. There was no way I was drinking that. Chris and Naveen seemed to share my sentiment, neither reaching for their cups. "What happened to the water, Ms. Thorne?" I pressed. "Is it some kind of algal bloom? Industrial pollution? The color isn't natural." Abigail laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Natural? What do you know of natural, boy? You with your Gore-Tex and your fancy boots. The falls are more natural now than they've ever been. They've returned to their true nature." She sat across from us, lifting her own cup and drinking deeply. A thin line of rust-colored liquid trickled from the corner of her mouth, which she wiped away with one of those 2 long fingers. 40 years back, I came here with my husband," she continued. "Thomas was a biologist, studying the unique ecosystem of the falls. The water was clear then, yes, full of trout that practically jumped into your pan. We built this cabin, planning to stay a season. Thomas took samples, made notes. Then he found the opening. "Opening?" Chris echoed. Abigail nodded, her head moving too far to one side, as if her neck contained extra vertebrae. "Behind the falls, a cave, but not just any cave, a doorway." Her voice dropped to a whisper, a way through to somewhere else. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The woman was clearly unstable, possibly suffering from environmental poisoning from whatever had contaminated the falls. Yet something in her pale eyes suggested she believed every word. "Thomas went in," she continued. "Stayed too long. When he came back, he wasn't himself anymore. Something came back wearing his skin. Something that knew things no person should know, that could do things no person should do." She leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "And it was hungry, so hungry." The firelight cast strange shadows across her face, deepening the hollows of her cheeks and eyes until she looked like a skull with skin stretched too tightly across it. "I tried to run, got as far as the edge of the gorge, but by then, the water had already started to change. The plants, too, and I—" She paused, running a tongue too long and too dark across her pointed teeth. "I changed with them." "Miss Thorne," Naveen said gently, his medical training evident in his calming tone, "I think you might be suffering from some kind of poisoning or infection. We can help you get to a hospital." Abigail's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or amusement. Such a good doctor, trying to make sense of what your science can't explain. She pushed the untouched cups toward us. "Drink. It helps with the transition, makes it easier." "Transition to what?" I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. "To what comes next," she said simply. "What always comes next when they find a way through. The becoming." Chris stood abruptly. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Thorne, but we should be going. We want to make camp before dark." Abigail didn't move, didn't even look up at him. "Too late for that. The sun's nearly down. They'll be waking soon, moving, hunting." As if to punctuate her words, a sound came from outside, a low, reverberating call that was neither animal nor human, but something hideously between. It echoed through the gorge, followed by another, then another, until the air vibrated with the chorus. "What is that?" Naveen whispered, turning toward the window. Abigail smiled her pointed smile. "The changed ones. Thomas's children, my children, your future siblings." I moved to the window, pulling aside the black cloth. The gorge had transformed in the fading light. The crimson mist glowed with bioluminescence, casting an unhealthy light over everything. The mushroom-like growths were opening, unfurling like flowers to reveal moist central cavities ringed with what looked disturbingly like teeth. The vines with eye-like protrusions had become more active, writhing along the ground in deliberate patterns. And there were figures moving among them, humanoid but wrong, their proportions distorted, limbs too long or bent at impossible angles. They emerged from the pools, crimson liquid streaming from bodies that seemed partially formed, as if the transformation from water to flesh was incomplete. "Oh my God," I breathed. "God has nothing to do with this place," Abigail said from directly behind me, her voice suddenly different, deeper, resonant with harmonics that made my teeth ache. "Not anymore." I turned and stumbled back against the window. Abigail stood too close, and she was changing. Her skin rippled as if something moved beneath it, her jaw distending, those pale eyes growing larger, rounder, the pupils expanding until there was nothing but blackness. "Time to meet the family," she said, her mouth stretching into a grin that literally split her cheeks, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth. Her fingers elongated further, the bones audibly cracking as they reformed into curved talons. Chris shouted a warning as Naveen lunged for the door. I was right behind them, shoving past the transforming Abigail, whose laughter followed us out into the gorge. Outside, the situation was even worse than it had appeared from the window. The changed ones, at least a dozen of them, moved among the pulsing growths, converging on the cabin. Some still retained recognizably human features, though distorted beyond recognition. Others had transformed so completely they appeared more plant or fungus than human, their bodies composed of the same fibrous material as the mushroom-like growths. "The trail!" Chris shouted, pointing to the path we'd descended. "Back up the gorge wall." We ran, dodging between the writhing vines that seemed to reach for us deliberately. Behind us, Abigail emerged from the cabin, no longer even remotely human, her body elongated and fluid, moving in ways that defied anatomy. "My children," she called, her voice booming through the gorge. "Bring them to the pools. It's time for them to join the family." The Changed Ones altered course, cutting off our path to the trail. We veered away, running parallel to the largest pool, searching desperately for another way up the steep gorge walls. "There," Naveen pointed to a series of rocky outcroppings that might serve as a natural staircase. "We can climb out there." We changed direction again, but the vegetation worked against us. Vines wrapped around my ankles, nearly sending me sprawling. I kicked free, only to feel something wet and sticky strike my back, some kind of projectile from one of the Changed Ones. The substance burned through my jacket instantly, searing the skin beneath. I cried out, stumbling. Chris grabbed my arm, hauling me forward. "Keep moving!" We reached the rock outcropping and began to climb. The stone was slick with moisture from the mist, making each handhold treacherous. Below us, the Changed Ones gathered, some beginning to climb in pursuit, moving with a spider-like agility that defied their misshapen forms. Halfway up the wall, Naveen's foothold crumbled beneath him. He slid several feet before managing to catch himself, but the delay cost us precious seconds. The nearest of the Changed Ones was nearly upon him, a hand that was more root than flesh reaching for his leg. "Go!" Naveen shouted to us. "I'll hold them off." Before we could protest, he had drawn his hunting knife and dropped back down to a wider ledge, facing the approaching creature. The Changed One lunged, and Naveen's knife flashed in the crimson light. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, as black fluid spurted from the wound. But there were more behind it, climbing steadily closer. Chris and I continued upward, driven by pure survival instinct. I tried not to listen to the sounds below. Naveen's shouts, the inhuman screeches of the Changed Ones, then a final, terrible scream that cut off abruptly. "Naveen!" Chris called. Chris, looking back down. "Keep climbing," I gasped, though my heart felt like it was being torn apart. "We can't help him now." We reached the rim of the gorge as the last light faded from the sky. The forest stretched before us, dark and seemingly impenetrable. Behind us, the Changed Ones continued their pursuit, the closest just 20 feet below the edge. We ran blindly into the trees, no thought now except to put distance between ourselves and the horrors of Eden Falls. The sweet rot smell followed us, carried on a wind that seemed to blow from all directions at once. The calls of the Changed Ones echoed through the forest, sometimes distant, sometimes terrifyingly close. Our flight through the darkness was a nightmare of crashing through underbrush, tripping over roots, rising only to run again. My back burned where the caustic fluid had struck me, and each breath felt like fire in my lungs. Chris wheezed beside me, his face pale in the occasional glimpses of moonlight filtering through the canopy. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for breath, straining our ears for sounds of pursuit. The forest had gone silent again, that same unnatural quiet we'd noticed earlier, as if all normal wildlife had fled. "Do you think we lost them?" Chris whispered after our breathing had slowed somewhat. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we can't keep running blind in the dark. We need to find the main trail." "Which direction is it?" I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find north. "Damn it!" "The stars," Chris suggested, looking upward, but the forest canopy was too thick, showing only occasional glimpses of the night sky. "Or the moss on the trees. It grows on the north side, right? But when we examined the nearest trees with our flashlights, we found the moss grew in strange patterns, spirals and whorls that looked disturbingly like faces frozen in silent screams. The contamination is spreading, I said quietly, examining a patch of the strange fungus. Whatever changed the falls is affecting the surrounding forest, too. What was that woman talking about? Chris asked, his voice shaking slightly. A doorway behind the falls? A way through to somewhere else? What does that even mean? I had no answers, only questions and a growing sense of dread. The caustic burn on my back throbbed, and when I reached over my shoulder to touch it, my fingers came away wet with a fluid that wasn't quite blood. Too thick, too dark, with the same faint luminescence as the mist in the gorge. "Chris," I said, trying to keep the panic from my voice, "we need to find help. Fast." I showed him my stained fingers. I think whatever hit me is doing something to me." His eyes widened with fear, but he nodded resolutely. "We'll head downhill. All water flows downhill, right? If we find a stream, it might lead us to a river, maybe eventually to a road or town." It was the best plan we had. We set off again, moving more carefully now, using our flashlights sparingly to preserve the batteries. Every sound in the darkness made us freeze. A branch creaking in the wind, leaves rustling, the occasional distant call that might have been an owl but sounded too much like the changed one's cries for comfort. My condition worsened as we walked. The burning sensation spread from the impact site, crawling across my back and down my arms. My skin felt tight, as if it were shrinking around my muscles and bones. Worse, my thoughts began to fragment, memories and perceptions blurring at the edges. Visions flashed before my eyes, glimpses of massive, impossible structures beneath a sky filled with unfamiliar stars, beings of living light that moved through dimensions beyond human comprehension, a vast, churning ocean of the same crimson liquid that filled the pools. "Michael?" Chris's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Michael, stay with me." I realized I had stopped walking and was standing motionless, staring at nothing. How long had I been like that? Seconds? Minutes? "Sorry," I mumbled. "I'm not feeling right." Chris looked terrified in the dim light of his flashlight. "Your eyes," he whispered. "They're changing color." I didn't need a mirror to know what he meant. I could feel the change, a pressure behind my eyeballs,